today. So I'm back for another crack at the ABC April 2025 collab hosted by Margaret and Tony. I will leave links to the ladies' channels in the description box below, and you can go along and get the calendar and the prompts list from their Ko-fi pages. You'll find that information on their channels, and the links to that is below. So today is the 15th, so M is our letter, and I've decided to have a bit of a crack at mixed media. Now I've put together a little page here of things that might help you if you're particularly new to junk journaling, art journaling, anything like that. I will go through it as we create something, but I just wanted to show you. So this is an example of a mixed media page. So when I first started crafting, the words mixed media, or the style of mixed media, was so confusing to me. I could not wrap my head around it. And it wasn't until, after I'd been crafting for a few years that I realised what mixed media was, or at least my interpretation of what mixed media is. And basically it's just being able to use or mix all of the different forms of art into one finished piece. So for example, if you're a watercolour artist, then you generally only use watercolours on your work. If you're an oil painter, you generally only use oil paint on your work. But most art journalers, junk journalers, are all mixed media artists because we're using a mix of different types of products. You use ink, you use paint, and you might use paper and cardboard and all the different things. So it's a mix of all the different art media available for us to use. So that's my interpretation of mixed media. I have put together a very simplistic sort of sheet. If you're a seasoned crafter, this will probably be of no benefit to you. But if you're someone who's just starting and trying to come up with a formula for how mixed media works, this might give you a bit of help. Okay, so I've got two identical pieces of card here, and I thought we might follow along with the basic steps. I'll be able to better show you some of the differences and hopefully help you be able to make choices about whether you want to put these products down on your pages before you begin. So I've gathered some supplies and I've got some gesso here. Now I'm going to add gesso to one of these cards. So I've just used some white gesso. So I'm just going to use a brayer to spread the gesso out onto my card. I find that using the brayer I get some nice texture in the paint. But it's just a personal choice. I'm not actually using a brayer for any other reason other than I like the sort of texture that I get on the background there. Alright, I'm not going to add any to this one so we can get a better idea of what happens, and I'm just going to dry that off now. Okay, so I have that pretty much dried off now. Now because I've applied gesso with the brayer, the coat is not 100% sealed, so I'm not sure if you'll be able to see, but there are little sections that I haven't got the gesso on very thickly, so those areas will react differently when we put stamp and ink and stamps and things like that on. So to start, I'm just going to take some water and spray that over the top, and you may be able to see on this one the water is kind of pooling because the gesso is essentially like a layer of plastic between the cardstock and the water now, whereas on this one the water is absorbing into the card much more easily than the other one. So onto this surface I want to add a little bit of Lindy's spray. So it's quite a darkish blue here, and I'm not going to spray it from the spray nozzle, I'm just going to drip it on from the straw. And then I'm going to add a little bit more water so I can help that colour move around a bit. So you can see on this one, the colour isn't really moving all that much. It's sort of staying in the drops where it fell because the colour had already soaked into the card because there's no layer between the card and the ink. Whereas on this one, I can freely move the colour around because that gesso is acting like a plastic barrier. So I'm just going to go ahead and dry those off again. Now as I'm drying, if I've got areas where my ink is pooling, I'm just going to use a paper towel just to pick that up so I don't get like an intense edge. Okay, so both of those are pretty much dry now. The other thing with gesso is if you reactivate a water reactive medium on gesso, you will then be able to pick up some of that medium. So if I now come in with some water and splash that over the top, you'll see that the water will react again. So you can see I've got those water splashes there because the plastic layer has basically just let that water reactivate the ink, and I can now lift it off. If I try to do the same on this one, I won't have as much success. I might be able to lift up a little bit of that ink, but not really. So the gesso really gives you a lot more control over what happens with the next layers of your project. Okay, so next I think I want to add some stenciling. Now I've got some very grubby stencils off to the side here. They're very well used, and if you are going to use a stencil on a background that has a lot of white in it, you might want to make sure that they are as clean as you can possibly get them before you pop anything over the top. Otherwise the colour from the stencil may bleed onto your work and you might not want that. There are a million different texture paste products. I like to use this paper texture paste because the texture paste itself absorbs some of the colour afterwards. There are some texture pastes that are more plasticky, so if you go to put colour on over the top, it sort of acts like gesso and doesn't allow for any of the medium to absorb into the paste. Actually, before I do texture paste, I want to add just some ink through a stencil. So I've got this one here that looks a bit like riveted metal, and I just want to add some ink with my stencil brush. I want to do this first because the texture paste is going to leave a raised surface on my work, so it will be a lot harder to go over the bumps with a stencil and a stencil brush after the fact. So I'm just going to go in with some scorched timber, and I want to use a piece of scrap paper. Just going to move this off to the side a little bit so that I can pick up the ink with my brush, but then I can wipe some of it off so that I'm not going in with such an intense colour to begin with. And for this, I'm going to start in the middle of my stencil and work to the edges. So my most intense colour will be in the middle and it will be a lot lighter on the edges. And it's a lot of sort of build up the layers rather than go all in at once. So I'm just going to lift that. So I'm happy with that, and then I'm going to move my stencil and rotate it so I don't get the exact same image. And I'm also making sure that the edge of my stencil design is actually hanging over the edge of my card so I don't get a harsh line where the design stops on the stencil. Okay, so I've just got some stenciling in the background there, and I'll just do the same with this one. So next I'm going to come in with this stencil that sort of has like an old English type of font on there, or German font, sorry, and just going to lay it over the top of my work. I'm just going to pick up some texture paste. Now I prefer not to wipe. Some people like to apply it multiple times over the same spot, but I prefer to wipe as a few times as I can, because the more you try to apply the medium, the more chances you've got of it going underneath the edges of the stencil and blurring the detail. And this is a particularly detailed stencil, so I'm just looking at where I want to start. So I'm going to have some up in this top corner, and I'm just sort of wiping it on as if I was buttering toast. And that will do. So I'm not sure, just wipe it off the edges there, if you can see that in the background there, because there's a lot going on now. And then I'm just going to set that aside to dry. Just trying to make sure that my stencil is straight. And I'm just going to do the same. So there we go. I'm just going to wipe it off the edges. Now if you've got lots of paste left on top of your stencil, you can scrape that off and pop it back into the jar. Now because my stencil has some colour on it, I have got colour in this paste, so I don't want to put that back in the jar, but I might just pop it into a journal that I've got going on up here, so I'm not wasting it. So that can just sit there and be the base layer of another project another time. Now it's a really good idea to wash your stencils straight away, because if your texture paste dries on your stencil, you won't have a nice detailed stencil anymore. So I'm just going to go and give these a quick rinse. Okay, so now I'm just going to dry that texture paste off really well. Okay, so both of my cards are pretty well dried off now. Alright, so I've got a good start on my background. Now I've had a bit of a think about what sort of focal image I want, and I think I'm going to use these vintage strips of these people. And whilst I could just stick those on and they would look perfectly fine like that, I really want to build a little bit more into the background to help them stand out as the real sort of place where your eye is drawn. So I'm going to use some very basic materials, things like book pages, scraps of other bits and pieces that I have cut up, and just little bits and pieces of paper that I've got lying around. So I'm going to grab some of those and I'll be right back. Okay, so I've got a little pile of scraps and bits and pieces out of my scrap box, as well as this piece of Tim Holtz paper that I've cut into at some point. So what I would like to do now is build a bit of a base underneath my image that helps draw my eye to the image. So I don't want to just layer like straight on top and then pop that down, because it's not enough variation for me. So I'm just going to tear strips, grab little scraps and start building a base to put these images onto. Now I prefer a torn edge, however saying that I do allow some straight edges here and there just because it gives variation to the look. So I'm just going to start tearing and layering some bits. Something else to note when you're tearing papers, particularly double-sided scrapbook papers, but any paper, is the way that you tear it will determine whether or not you get this white edge. So let's take this piece here. So you can see I've got this white edge here. Now if I tear this paper and I'm pulling this piece down away from me, I won't get the white edge. It's a nice edge that is just the same as the paper on the top. However, when I turn this over, you will see that we've got the white edge here. So alternatively, if you want to have the white edge, instead of tearing the paper away from you, if you tear it towards you, you will get that white edge along the torn part of your paper. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with those bases and I don't want to lose my place. So at this point you can either take a photo of your work before you start undoing things, or sometimes I find it easier to just lift off my focal point, straighten things up a little bit. I prefer lines to be either vertical or horizontal. I'm not so much keen on things that are sort of all diagonals and things like that, but that's just a personal opinion. So just have a quick look. Yep, still happy with that. So I'm just going to grab some glue and I'm just going to basically tack these together. I'm not gluing them to my background yet. I'm just gluing them to each other. Now if you find it easier, you could use a staple or a glue stick, and you might even want to take it to your sewing machine and stitch it once you've glued the bits together. So I'm just going to set that aside. To dry, and do the same for this one. Okay, so I have tacked down my backgrounds and I've come back to these pieces with my stenciling, and I'm just going to decide if I want to try to enhance that stenciling and make it stick out a little bit more. So I think I might go in with a little bit of ink. Work on this one first. Now I don't have any gesso in here, so it's going to grab in the background and I'm not going to be able to move it. So that just helps that texture paste stick out a little bit. Then I'm going to do the same on this one. Okay, so I've added some ink over the texture paste. Now, funnily enough, the texture paste looks more prominent on this one than this one, and I think it's because the ink is lighter in the background here. You can't really tell, but the ink is lighter here. If I add some water, which I'm going to do now, I'll be able to pick up the ink again. Not so much on this one, although I should be able to pull it up off the texture paste a little bit more. So you can see that ink is gathering around the stenciling there. Just going to move it around. And then I'll dab some of it off. Now this one I won't be able to pick it up, but you can actually see that the water has reacted with some of that ink that we popped on with the blending brush, and it's gone a funny purple colour. But this is the joy of mixed media. You get all sorts of weird and wonderful things happen. Alright, so I'm going to give those another dry. Alright, so I'm pretty happy with how these backgrounds are looking now, so I want to work a bit more on the focal points. Now these images are quite flimsy, so I'm going to back these onto some white chipboard. And I'm just going to roughly cut them out, leaving a couple millimetres around the edges, and then I'll distress that quite heavily so it'll look very rugged and rough around the edges. Okay, so I've got my images looking nice and distressed there, and I'll bring back their original base pieces. I'm just going to pop a little bit of glue in the middle of the image at the top and the bottom, just enough to tack it to the background, roughly where I want it, but that still gives me the ability to poke things in around the edges if I want. And I can always go back in after I'm happy with everything and secure it a bit better if I feel like I need to. Okay, so that's how my bits are looking, but I want to come in with some more precise looking pieces. So I've got, this is the box that I keep all of Reenie's little bits in all the different colours, and I'm just going to have a look at what I might like to add to create a bit more interest around my images. And I'm going to work pretty much in a single colour scheme. So I'm using sort of the greeny colours on this one, and I might add in neutrals or something like that. And on this one I think I'll work with the blues, maybe teals and blues. And I'm just adding bits and pieces here and there just for interest. Might just tuck in a few of these little bits around here. Okay, so I'm just going to add a little bit of ink around the edges of some of these bits. Seeing how I'm only using that bit at the top, I'm just going to cut the bottom of that off and save that for another project. Okay, so now I'm going to tuck all these bits and pieces in before I glue down my finished piece. Now I could have glued this down and then just tucked the pieces in around it, but I'm not sure that I'm finished with my background, which is why I haven't glued that down yet. Now I'm going to save these bits to glue on afterwards, but what I think I want to do to finish off is just add some stamping in the background. Now I like this stamp. It's got two different types of font on it and it's very well used, and I've actually just written which direction up it goes in so that when I grab it, because I don't often use this on a block, that way I can automatically tell which way is the correct way up. And the reason I don't want to use it on a block is because I don't want the impression that I get from the stamp to be perfect. I just want it to be a little bit sort of hit and miss. So I've just got a tiny little bit of the script there. And because of the texture paste, the stamp isn't going down amongst the letters as much because the texture paste is pushing the stamp up. And I'm just stamping around the edges because my focal point is going to take up most of the room. So I don't need to really stamp in the middle. And I'll do the same on this one. Okay, so I'm going to glue my focal points down now. And again, I'm just gluing mostly in the middle in case I decide I want to tuck anything else in around the edges. And I've decided to offset my focal point to one side. That's just a personal preference. You can have it in the middle, up the top, down the bottom, wherever you like. And the same for this one. Okay, so I have them glued down, and I don't really like this straight edge here on this piece of paper, so I might try and just rough that up a little bit with my fingernail. Okay, so I think I want to add a little bit of messy stitching around my pictures here. Now my sewing machine may struggle a little bit because these are pretty thick, but if it ends up in a bit of a mess, I'll just say that it was meant to be like that. That's what mixed media lets you do. Okay, so I have just added some stitching around there, and you can see that's gone all the way through to the back, so I may cover these up at the end or use them as just a journal topper. So I want to just add a little bit more stamping around my image just to sort of help draw that eye into the middle there. So I'm going to pull out my documented stamps. And just going to add some stamping around my image. I've got a little pussycat visitor trying to get up here. And come up. Now, I'm not sure if I want to add any of these, or perhaps I want to add a more defined label. Don't eat the glue. This is Willow. She's about 10 months old, and she likes to climb up on my desk and then climb up on my shoulder. You saying hello? Okay, to finish off, I've picked out a couple of labels from my stash here, and I think I want to lay these up with a little bit of cheesecloth just for texture. I'm not sure which one of these I want. No, I don't want that one. So I've just got some rusty fabric here, so I could layer it up with some of that. And maybe a little bit of cheesecloth as well. And I think I'm going to attach my label to my fabric with my tiny attacher. Just again for a little bit of a different look. And to finish off, I'm just going to go around the edges with my scissors and distress the edges of my card. And then I'm just going to go around the edges with a little bit of ink, just to highlight that distressed edge. Okay, now the very last thing according to our list is we could add some words, but we've added a label instead. I think I want to add some splashes. I think I might add some white splashes for this one. So all I'm going to do is get a little bit of white gesso and add a little bit of water to that just to make it a bit of a more runny consistency. And I'm just going to mix the water and the gesso, and I've got a pretty small paintbrush here. Now I don't want to end up with splashes on their faces, so I'm just going to cover that with a piece of scrap paper and just add some splashes. Now you can be as heavy or as light-handed with this as you like. And then as a final finishing touch, I'm just going to add some of my vintage tape. There we go. I feel like I need a little bit up here too. Or maybe not. Oh well, down there now. Good enough. So there we go. They are our mixed media cards. Now as you can see, there's not a lot of the background available for you to see anymore because it's in the background and it's under all the focal points or the focal image. For me, mixed media is more about the process of just enjoying playing with the mediums and, you know, seeing how things react. As we found out with this one without the gesso on, the ink, when I added water to it, went sort of a purpley shade. All of that's underneath there now and you can't see it anymore, but you know, I've learned that for next time if I want to ever get that result again. You can, of course, achieve this sort of look without going to all of this effort. You could use a scrapbook paper in the background. You could just layer your image up with a few scraps and pop a label on, and it would be a very similar sort of finish. So that's what I mean when I say, for me, mixed media is more about the journey rather than the end product. But it's really fun to get messy sometimes and to learn new things about the products that we use. And sometimes you make a new discovery and have a bit of a happy accident. I hope that has been helpful for anyone who is new. I'm sorry if that was boring to all of you people that are advanced. You've probably clicked off long ago. Thank you so much for joining me today. I am having a great time with the ABC April 2025 collab, so I'm sure I'll be back with another video. But for now, I'll see you again next time. Thanks. Bye.